Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckle as it's known in Japan, was released in North America back in September of 1991 for the Sega Genesis. Why this is historically significant is because back during this time period, Capcom's Final Fight was eating quarters like no one's business in arcades everywhere. Nintendo had managed to secure exclusivity for the North American console port of Final Fight for their newly launched Super Nintendo, leaving Genesis fans out in the cold. Sega, as they always did, wanted to make sure they had something to keep their fans occupied. So in 1991, they released what many consider to be one of the greatest beat-em-ups of all time, Streets of Rage. The SNES port of Final Fight had a ton of problems. It dropped one of the 3 playable characters, was missing an entire level from the arcade version, all female gang members were replaced with generic male counterparts, and the worst sin of all, the cooperative multiplayer mode was nowhere to be found. So needless to say, it was a pretty butchered port of the arcade classic, but still, the SNES had a game with the name Final Fight on the cover, and that was a truly big deal. Streets of Rage would correct everything wrong with the SNES port of Final Fight. This game featured 3 playable characters, it included 8 incredibly detailed stages, and above all, it featured a kick-ass 2-player cooperative multiplayer mode. It was the ultimate beat-em-up on any home console at that particular point in time, and to this very day, it holds up incredibly well. When the SEGA CD launched back in October 1992, one of the pack-in games was a collection called the SEGA Classics Arcade Collection. It was a 4-in-1 set that included Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, Columns, and Golden Axe. A year later, Sega would release an updated version of this collection, which included Super Monaco GP. The footage you're seeing here is from that first compilation disc, and in the future I plan to review the Genesis version of Streets of Rage as well, because, well, it just gives me an excuse to play the game again. Like most beat-em-ups at the time, the story is pretty much minimalistic. A once peaceful city has been taken over by a criminal syndicate, and it's up to Adam, Axel, and Blaze to push the syndicate back and reclaim the city. It's as simple as that. Each character has their own unique strengths and weaknesses. Axel is powerful but can't jump very high. Adam is strong as well but moves slow. And Blaze is quick and nimble but isn't that strong. You can also perform throws and grapple attacks, and if you're playing with a second player, you can grab hold of your partner and they can perform a fierce attack or a throw attack. If that weren't enough, you also have access to special attacks, although unlike many beat-em-ups at the time, here your characters don't actually do anything and instead call for a police officer or reinforcements who drive into view and shoot a bazooka that pretty much acts as a screen-clearing bomb attack. One of the best aspects of Streets of Rage is the inclusion of multiple endings and several difficulty levels. If you play on easy, you can polish off the entire game in under an hour or so, but if you put it on hard, well, you'll be coming back more than once because the game can get extremely difficult. While the characters may not be as large or as detailed as those featured in Final Fight, there are more enemies on the screen at any given time. This makes the play area feel a lot larger than it actually is, although you still have to be careful you don't beat the snot out of your friends. The environments, while not as varied as those featured in the sequel, are most certainly detailed and do a fine job of setting up the action. I can't talk about Streets of Rage without mentioning the soundtrack. Legendary video game composer Yuzo Koshiro earned his legendary status by working on this very game. I'm not kidding around when I say this is my absolute favorite soundtrack on the Sega Genesis. I find it utterly classic and timeless. It features incredible mixes of dance, hip-hop, and funk, and the sheer quality always amazes me. The Genesis was not known for its sound capabilities, but listening to the music here, you would never know it. I listen to this soundtrack all the time because it's just so damn good. For this Sega CD port, the music wasn't touched at all, and neither were any of the sound effects. The only portion of the game that was reworked in terms of audio were the voice samples. They're all CD quality now, but honestly, that's barely worth mentioning. Everything else is exactly as it was on the Sega Genesis. You can pick up the Sega CD version as part of the SEGA Classics Arcade Collection for about $15 or so on sites like eBay. The Genesis version goes for a little bit more, usually around the $25 to $40 mark, depending on the condition and whether or not it's a complete in-box copy. The game has also been released on countless other SEGA Arcade collections and has even been ported to the Game Gear and Master System. There's a 3D version available on the 3DS, and it's also available on the Wii's Virtual Console. There's even an iOS port of the game, or if that's not your cup of tea, you can play it on PC via Steam. Whatever the case may be, Streets of Rage is a timeless classic that deserves to be played. It's one of my favorite beat-em-ups of all time and is yet another testament to the power of Sega during the early 90s.